Welcome back. This video is about how I used a few pieces of scrap wood to build a screwdriver holder for my workshop/garage. So if you were looking for more band-made content, you'll just have to wait till my next video. But on to the topic. Like most homeowners, I assume, I've always had a few screwdrivers laying around, a couple of flatheads, a couple of Phillips. I don't even remember where I got these. And I also have a couple of ratcheting screwdrivers where you can change the bits out. But almost every time I work on any project, it turns out I need an actual screwdriver. So I finally bought myself a set of 15 screwdrivers. I'd never heard of this brand, Quinn, before, but it was at Harbor Freight, and I've had really good luck with the mid-range tools. I haven't ventured into the really expensive ones yet, and some of the cheap ones are actually kind of cheap, but the mid-range ones, as this one was, have done me well so far. So I got them. They feel really sturdy. They look really nice. They're marked on the ends, whether they're flathead or Phillips, and on the handle, they tell you what the exact size is. Came with 15 screwdrivers in a various assortment of sizes and lengths. And like most of these sets of screwdrivers, it doesn't come with a way to hold them or store them, which is probably a good idea because if it did come with one, it might not fit your area and it might not work right. It might have been a pouch when you wanted to stand, or it might have been a wall rack when you wanted a pouch or something like that. And I didn't have really good luck finding little stands for screwdrivers or holders or organizers at any store. Now, Harbor Freight sells these little plastic trays, which were so inexpensive I went ahead and bought a set just to see how they would work. And here you can see I've set these screwdrivers on these plastic trays, but because the screwdrivers are different lengths, some of them stick out beyond the edge of the shelf. And of course the handles have to be opposite each other, so some of the handles are at the back and some of the handles are at the front, and it wasn't enough for all my screwdrivers. So as I usually do when I want to solve a problem like this, I peruse YouTube for a little bit and then come up with my own design. At first, I considered a long vertical board with holes drilled diagonally in it that would hold the screwdrivers diagonally with the handles sticking out. The immediate downside of that was that I would need a long vertical place in my garage in which to attach that board so that the screwdrivers would be handy, and I couldn't really find a good spot. I had several places where I could attach a long vertical board, but not where the screwdrivers would be easily accessible, and also not in a place where a kid wouldn't run into them trying to get their bike out of the garage, that sort of thing. And so I decided on a more traditional flat board with holes stuck through it and the screwdrivers going through it, but I still liked the idea of the 45-degree angle. But instead of drilling the holes at a 45-degree angle, which would be more difficult for an amateur such as myself, I just decided to drill the holes straight through and then turn the board at a 45-degree angle. And I used my notebook and a straight edge to kind of draw out the plan here of what the whole thing would look like. I decided to use flat plywood pieces for the left and right ends, and then little 1x2s at the bottom and the back to hold the two ends together, and then a 2x4 for the crossbar that the screwdrivers would actually stick through. And the reason I chose a board as thick as a 2x4 was because I wanted to drill the holes pretty close in size to the actual shaft of each screwdriver so that they wouldn't rattle around in there. I thought the thinner the board, the more chance there would be for the screwdrivers to actually move inside the holes, whereas the thicker the board and therefore the longer each hole was, the more snugly it would hold the screwdriver. I don't know how true that is, but that's what it seemed like to me. Also, a 2x4 is wide enough that I could make more than one row of holes. One of the first things that I did was attach my DIY Moxon vise to the edge of my new work table, and I started planing off the 2x4 because the edges were pretty rough, and so rough that it would have taken an awful lot of sanding. This little planer has turned out to be really handy. It's obviously not going to be great for leveling out a large board, but for just smoothing down rough portions of a board, it's about perfect for that. And here is where I was marking off where all the holes on the board would be. I had drawn a sample, life-size sample on a sheet of paper first to figure out how many holes and how many rows of holes I would need to fit the screwdrivers in a board of a certain length. And I also used a test board and drilled several holes at the distance that I thought would be appropriate to see if the handles would fit next to each other, because some of those handles were over an inch in diameter. So I wanted the holes to be far enough apart that, I could reach each handle next to each other, and settled on this distance of about 1.5 inches between the holes on the upper and lower rows, and then a middle row offset between the other two rows. And so here is the footage of me drawing all these grid lines and then using my automatic punch to get the holes ready to start. And then I used my little set of manual calipers to measure the thickness of each shaft of each screwdrivers because I wanted the holes to be customized. I would have wider holes for the wider shafted screwdrivers and tiny narrow holes for the narrow shafted screwdrivers, which made sense if I didn't want the screwdrivers to wobble in the holes. And I put a piece of scrap wood underneath my main piece of wood here and just started drilling pilot holes. I used the same bit to drill all of these pilot holes across the board, and then I started switching out with wider bits for the screwdrivers that I had decided would go in certain holes. I picked the 3 or 4 screwdrivers that I thought I would use the most often, and I put those holes in the center because I thought that would be the most obvious place to grab them. And then at the far right and the far left, I put the tiny little screwdrivers. the really short stubby ones and the really narrow tiny ones meant for like a tiny machine work. And then in between the center and the ends is where I would put all the rest of the screwdrivers. And here is an overhead shot of me finishing out the different widths holes and laying out the screwdrivers on the table in the order that they would go into the holder, so I would remember what order to put them in which holes so I wouldn't have to figure it out later. And here I'm cutting the plywood ends. By the way, I did use entirely scrap wood for this project. I didn't buy any new wood. I had some 1x2 red oak laying around. I had several lengths of 2x4 in my scrap wood bin, and I still had some 3/4 inch thick plywood from making this work table. I did use a hand saw for all of this sawing because I didn't want to break out a power tool and create tons of dust for such a small project. Not pictured here is the hour or more that I spent outside sanding these things, but I did sand it, and here is my finished product with all the screwdrivers installed. You can see that it's not finished in any way here, but I did just use regular screws through the ends of the plywood to attach the ends to the crossbars here. And I haven't yet decided whether I want to use, paint or clear coat polyurethane or paste wax or what, but for now it's just going to be bare wood, and the screwdrivers go in and out of the holes fairly easily because the holes were made for the screwdrivers. A couple are a little bit more snug than others because I didn't have, all the bits you would need for all the exact sizes of these shafts. Of course, the flatheads are a little wider at the end, so the hole has to be wider than the shaft, and so they're going to wobble a little bit more. But anyway, there's the set, and I made sure before I started building it that it would fit on these, new shelves that I had built several months ago, and of course it does. You can see them there in place on the shelves, and there's enough space behind that little holder so I can slip things behind there, like my old jigsaw box and a few other items. But anyway, now I should always have the screwdriver that I need with the, the size of the bit that I need just to grab without having to search for a bit to put in one of those interchangeable bit ratcheting screwdrivers, which sometimes gets a little frustrating if it's not one of the 2 or 3 standard bits that you use all the time. So these screwdrivers are going to always be handy. They're always going to be right there. I didn't spend a thing on this project except for the screwdriver set itself, which, if you know Harbor Freight, didn't cost that much. And it was relatively easy to put together. I think the hardest part was just planning it and making sure that I would have enough room on the board to put all the screwdrivers in and making sure I had enough room on the shelves to get the finished product in there. And of course I did. I will say that because I'm not a professional woodworker, that it does wobble just a little bit. As hard as I tried, I did not get the finished product perfectly square. As far as I could tell with the tools that I have, each of the pieces was square when I finished cutting and sanding them, but when I attached them, even though I had everything held in place with a number of clamps in various directions, the final product isn't perfectly square, which is probably to be expected. I just didn't want to give anyone the impression that I did this perfectly with no skills or training. I have some of those little break-off shims, and what I plan to do is just break off one of those just enough to slip under the back edge. It's the rear right corner, and then I'm just going to glue that on there, and then use a flush cut saw to make sure that it's even around the edges and then it won't wobble anymore. Anyway, thank you for being here. Let me know what you've been working on in your garage or shop. And of course, feel free to tell me if you think I did anything ridiculous in this project. I'll see you next time.